Hopefully that's fine. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning. We have hundreds of people who have registered and probably will join us. So without further ado, Laura, I would like to thank you for the summary. And everyone, I reached out to Laura and I said, you know what? I think a webinar will make this even more accessible. So I think that is the idea behind this webinar. Please take it from here.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nama, for having me, and Smart Density for having me to present on this topic. Before I dive in, I'll just give you a little bit of background about myself. My name is Laura Dean. I'm a lawyer at Aird & Burles, and I practice in the area of municipal and land use planning law. Prior to becoming a lawyer, I worked as a senior policy advisor with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. And that's where I discovered municipal law and land use planning law, and where I really fell in love with it. And so I went to law school explicitly to become a lawyer in this area. And it hasn't ceased to disappoint. You know, it never does. There's, as everybody out there knows, always something new being proposed. And so it keeps us on our toes, and it's very exciting stuff. And so I'm here to present today a presentation we've called Ontario Makes a Statement. And what I'd like to do is really just give an overview of the proposed planning statement. And I'm highlighting those policies that I think really are going to have the most significant impact on municipalities across the province. So let's get started. So land use planning in Ontario, just for those in the audience, you know, are probably planners, I'm assuming. Others in the industry will be familiar with this already, but I'd like to start with the basics anyway. Of course, we know that land use planning in Ontario is implemented with a top-down approach. So the province sets high-level policies, and then these are implemented in official plans. And these are called, official plans are often referred to as the vehicle for implementing policy statements and provincial plans. And of course, versions of the provincial policy statement 2020, which is the current, what we call PPS, and the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, so we just refer to it as the growth plan. These documents have been guiding land use planning decisions in Ontario since 2005 and 2006, respectively. And I would defer to others who have been in the game longer than me about what was in place before that, but sort of these documents as we know them evolved around 2005 and 2006 and have been updated various years and changed, of course. So why are we here? And not in an existential sense, why are we here, but what are we doing and why are we giving this webinar? Why is it important? Well, on April 6th, the province released a draft provincial planning statement. If the statement is adopted, it would replace the growth plan and the PPS 2020. And the idea is that integrating these documents to create a single province-wide housing-focused land use planning document, it's intended to speed up government approval processes. And so why is this important? Well, it really comes down to this test of consistency. So what's being called the provincial planning statement, it's a provincial policy statement. So it's been given this name, I think, to differentiate it from all the other planning statements that came before. But under the Planning Act, this provincial planning statement, it is a provincial policy statement. And so the Planning Act has certain requirements for such that fall as a result of these statements. And we like to call it the test for consistency. So the Planning Act requires that decisions of public bodies in respect of the exercise of any planning authority and comments, submissions, or advice that are provided by public bodies affecting a planning matter must be consistent with provincial planning statements. So of course that includes, you know, official plans have to be consistent with provincial planning, policy statements. Here we are. Sorry about that. Forgot to turn to the slide. So as I was saying, test of consistency. The Planning Act requires decisions to be consistent and comments, submissions, and advice to be consistent with provincial policy statements. So that's why we care. These are the policies that drive the planning decisions from the top down to the municipalities. So planners in the audience who've appeared as expert witnesses before the Ontario Land Tribunal will certainly be able to attest to the importance of this test. And, in reviewing this latest planning statement, I kept thinking it would be a fun exercise to actually go and canvass some of the more recent OLT decisions and to consider whether any of those may have been decided differently under these, if this provincial planning statement were in effect currently. So, we'll see what sorts of shifts may occur as a result of this, but it's definitely something to consider. Could be a fun topic for another webinar. So I wanted to just also contextualize as well the changes. I wanted so that you can understand the provincial planning statement in context. Of course, the More Homes, More Choice Ontario Housing Supply Action Plan came out in 2019. And along with that came Bill 108. And Bill 108 was repealed many, but not all of the amendments that had been previously introduced by the former government. Through Bill 139, that might sound familiar to many, and that's what sort of had this two-stage planning appeal process and made a change to the Ontario Municipal Board to the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal, and so that was all repealed through Bill 108. Bill 108 also introduced community benefits charge, and which replaced Section 37 density bonusing, among other things. So this is just meant to be sort of a very high level overview of some of what's been happening. But of course, this is sort of underneath all of this is packed with many amendments and new regulations, et cetera. So again, I commend to you a number of webinars that Aired and Burles has done through and news flashes over the past several years as we're keeping track of all of this. So of course, then we had in 2022 is the More Homes Built Faster Ontario Housing Supply Action Plan for that year. And so that's where the pledge of 1.5 million homes by 2031, that's where that came from. And then of course, we got Bill 23, More Homes Built, I got a typo there, sorry about that, Built Faster Act. And of course, other changes that were imposed through there, multiple amendments to many statutes affecting municipalities, including scaling back development charges, changes to parkland dedication, restrictions on third-party appeals, among other things. And so then more recently, this month, we saw the next phase of the province's Housing Supply Action Plan, the release of Bill 97, which is the Helping Homebuyers Protecting Tenants Act, which is making its way through the legislature. And then we also have the introduction now of the provincial planning statement. So just to dive right into the statement, and the way that I'm structuring the presentation is in alignment with the way that the provincial planning statement is laid out. So just to take you, from the top to the bottom, basically to get a feel for the policies that that are being proposed. And so not the way that this has kind of come together is that some of the statement's policies and definitions are entirely new. Some of them have been carried over from the PPS 2020, or in many cases have been modified. And when they're modified, they're to further this goal of increasing residential development. And the statement also incorporates a number of growth plan policies and definitions, and some of which have been modified to align with this goal of increasing residential development. So just very quickly, the new vision, the new PPS creates a new vision. It gets rid of that statement at the beginning of the document that sets out the province's vision. And this is not an operative. These aren't operative policies contained in here, but they really do. They're intended to provide some context for the policy, so you can understand what the government is aiming to do. Another important change, there's an identification in the proposed planning statement of large and fast-growing municipalities. So this is a defined term, and the statement identifies 29 large and fast-growing municipalities, and they're considered to be municipalities with the greatest need for housing. So you can see on there. And the importance of that is that there are, as I said, certain policies that just apply to these identified municipalities. So to speak about the policies that have to do with housing, the province has included some additional housing types in the definition of housing options. So that would include laneway housing, garden suites, rooming houses, and low and mid-rise apartments. So just to specifically identify those when it's discussing its housing options. Planning authorities would no longer be required to establish and implement minimum targets for the provision of housing which is affordable to low and moderate income households. Planning authorities would be required to coordinate land use planning and planning for housing with service managers to address the full range of housing options, including housing affordability needs. Service managers is not a sort of a defined term in the Act, but they're established in the Housing Services Act. And service managers across the province, they oversee affordable housing projects in their service area. And they're not an actor that has appeared before, to my knowledge, in these provincial policy statements. So it seems to be sort of a new approach to reference them. And then the conversion of existing commercial and institutional buildings for residential use is identified as a type of residential intensification. So there's this acknowledgement of perhaps this adaptive reuse that's contained in there in one of the policies. So moving on to the policies about settlement areas. The statement proposes to make significant changes to these policies. The identification of new settlement areas and the expansion of settlement area boundaries is proposed to be able to take place at any time. Currently, identification of new settlement areas and expansion of these boundaries can only take place during a municipal comprehensive review when a municipality is reviewing its official plan. That concept of municipal comprehensive review is nowhere to be found in the proposed planning statement. So therefore, these settlement areas can be identified and expanded at any time. However, subject to requirements that are set out in the PPS, but these are far less stringent in what's being proposed than what we currently see today. For example, currently there's a requirement to show that alternative locations have been evaluated. That has been removed, and in fact, there's no need to demonstrate anything anymore. Assuming the statement comes forward. I don't want to keep sort of assuming that all of this will be adopted as it is. We don't know. So it's not enforced yet, but it's easy to slip into. This is the new way it is, because very likely that is what we will see. But in any event, when it comes to the settlement areas, as I was saying before, currently you actually have to demonstrate, for example, that alternative locations have been evaluated and there's other requirements. The way that this has been redrafted, it provides only that planning authorities should consider certain things. For example, that there's planned infrastructure in existence, that the lands don't compromise specialty crop areas, that it complies with minimum distance separation formulae, that impacts on agricultural lands and operations that are adjacent are avoided, or where they can't be avoided, minimized and mitigated. And there's this idea that any new settlement area needs to be sort of phased. There needs to be a phased progression of the development on that land. This is what the policy says. Sometimes when you read this, you sort of have to. I hate to say it, you have to kind of guess what some of these policies mean, to be honest. I'm not sure what phased progression of urban development means, but that's the way these policies work, and there's always room for interpretation. So Large and fast-growing municipalities would just now be encouraged to plan for a minimum density target of 50 residents and jobs per gross hectare. And all other planning authorities would be encouraged to establish density targets for new settlement areas or settlement area expansion lands as appropriate based on local conditions. So we see here, certain shift to allowing municipalities to set their own planning priorities in certain ways, except for it. And even in this case, large and fast-growing municipalities are encouraged to plan for this minimum density target. So moving on to the policies regarding strategic growth areas. Large and fast-growing municipalities would be required to identify and focus growth and employment in strategic growth areas. And this is a concept that's been carried over and integrated from the growth plan. And these areas are to be identified in official plans. They should focus on growth, and they include major transit station areas. So it also states that reductions in size or change in location of an urban growth center could only occur through new official plan or official plan amendment adopted under Section 26 of the Planning Act. And that's where the minister is the approval authority and there is no appeal to the tribunal. I see there's a question in the chat, so maybe I don't know how you want to handle those, Nama.
I think at the end, I think at the very end of your presentation, it will make more sense because I invited people to just post their questions as you go. So I think it will make more sense to not interrupt your flow.
Okay, that sounds great. So moving on to major transit station areas, this concept is carried forward from the growth plan, and the definition is the same. The proposed policy would require large and fast-growing municipalities to delineate the boundaries of these major transit station areas on higher order transit corridors through a new official plan amendment adopted under Section 26 of the Planning Act. So again, that's where the minister is the approval authority, and that approval can't be appealed to the tribunal. And the minimum density targets have been carried over from the growth plan, and I've set them out here on the slide. So moving on to the policies with respect to employment, there's a lot here to dig into, and I almost think that it could itself be its own webinar. Again, there's a lot of interesting things that the province is proposing when it comes to employment and employment areas. To start out, the provincial planning statement proposes a new definition of employment areas, and this is consistent with the definition that is proposed in Bill 97 for areas of employment. And so this new definition, it would explicitly exclude sorry. Yes. It would explicitly exclude institutional and commercial uses from employment areas, including retail and office that is not associated with the primary employment use. So this is a big change because, as we know, at present, retail and office uses could essentially be included in an employment area at the municipality's discretion. And so we see that in the City of Toronto and the city grappling with that. This definition would explicitly exclude institutional and commercial uses from employment areas that don't relate to the primary employment uses. And those primary employment uses are set out in the definition as well to explicitly include manufacturing and research and development in connection with manufacturing, warehousing, goods movement, which is new addition, associated retail, and office and ancillary facilities. So this is a sort of big direction from the province because, as we know, there has been a lot of conversation about whether retail and office uses are appropriate in employment areas. The policies would also promote the intensification of employment uses and a more permissive mix of uses outside of employment areas, with a focus on encouraging mixed use developments. The policy also would propose to remove the PPS 2020 policy, which requires separation or mitigation from sensitive land uses within employment areas planned for industrial and manufacturing uses. And the planning authority would be permitted to remove lands from employment areas at any time, but only where it has been demonstrated that the removal satisfies the listed requirements. So again, it's not anymore being called a conversion, they're calling it a removal, which is just a difference in language that could potentially be important. And something to note as well that's not here on the slide, but is that the provincially significant employment zones that were identified in the growth plan are not proposed to be carried over, but the government has noted that it's seeking feedback on these PSEZs to understand whether there's another approach that might be required to protect those lands. And it suggests perhaps a minister's zoning order may be one way to do that. So now moving on to the land use compatibility policies. The statement would incorporate the policy of the PPS 2020, which requires major facilities and sensitive land uses to be planned and developed to, and I've listed avoid, or if avoidance is not possible, minimize and mitigate potential adverse effects from odor, noise, and other contaminants, minimize risk to public health and safety, and ensure the long-term operational and economic viability of major facilities in accordance with provincial guidelines, standards, and procedures. So that is still there. What is different now is that the planning statement would remove the requirement for the proponent of a sensitive land use to demonstrate the need for that land use to be located in that area, or to evaluate alternative locations for sensitive land uses where avoidance isn't possible. Instead, what the planning statement would direct is that where avoidance is not possible, sensitive land uses would be permitted adjacent to major facilities if potential impacts to industrial, manufacturing, or other major facilities are minimized and mitigated in accordance with provincial guidelines, standards, and procedures. So it looks like there would be an onus on the proponent of the sensitive land use to demonstrate that it wouldn't have these potential impacts, that these potential impacts would be minimized or mitigated. That's a big change. Speaking of big changes, there are a number of proposed policies in the agriculture section that are different from what we've seen. Certainly, municipalities would now lead the designation of prime agricultural areas, including specialty crop areas, and using the provincial mapping would remain an option. So although the policy statement speaks to encouraging a geographically continuous agricultural land base through an agricultural system approach, it would no longer require municipalities to use the provincially mapped agricultural system. The proposed statement would also allow up to 2 additional residential units, which are subordinate to the principal dwelling in prime agricultural areas, and provided certain conditions are met, and those are all set out in the statement, and that includes, for example, that the additional residential units are to be within, attached to, or close in proximity to the principal dwelling, that any additional residential unit would comply with the minimum distance separation formulae, that any additional residential unit would be compatible with and not hinder surrounding agricultural operations, and that appropriate sewage and water services would be provided. And then a total of 3 residential lots may be created from a lot or parcel of land in prime agricultural areas, provided again that certain conditions are met. And I might as well discuss those. The conditions would be that agriculture would be the principal use of the existing lot. The second is that the total number of lots created would not exceed 3, so it's set out there in my bullet. Any new lot would have to be located outside of a specialty crop area. Again, would have to comply with the minimum distance separation formulae. It would be required, would be limited to the minimum size needed to accommodate the use that's being proposed. It would also have to have appropriate sewage and water services. It would have to have access on a public road with appropriate frontage for ingress and egress. And also, I find this one interesting, is adjacent to existing non-agricultural land uses or consists primarily of lower priority agricultural lands. So that seems to be an important qualifier in terms of the ability to create new lots in prime agricultural areas. Also included is a requirement for an agricultural impact assessment to be prepared where it's not possible to avoid impacts from new or expanding non-agricultural uses on surrounding agricultural lands and operations. So natural heritage, there's a lot of us out there that are waiting on the province to release its natural heritage policies. At the time this document was released, the natural heritage policies and all of the definitions remained under consideration. So these are going to be put out there for review and input on the Environmental Registry of Ontario, we are told, and this link will be updated to the relevant posting. So stay tuned. Hazards. The provincial policy statement would continue to require planning authorities to identify hazardous lands and hazardous sites and to manage development in these areas in accordance with provincial guidance. And then in terms of human-made hazards, interestingly, the proposed statement would remove the current PPS requirement for planning authorities to support, where feasible, on-site and local reuse of excess soil through planning and development approvals while protecting human health and the environment. So we're getting to the end here. Effective date and transition. And the effective date would be specified through an order in council approved by the Lieutenant Governor in council. Any decision on a planning matter that's made on or after the effective date would be subject to the new policies. However, Bill 97 does include the authority to give the minister the ability to pass transition regulations for the PPS. Official plans are expected to be updated as necessary to implement these new policies at the time of their ordinary review cycle. And the province has stated that it expects municipalities would maintain these forecasts that they already have to 2051, and those would continue to be used, but that that these municipalities would move towards doing their own forecasting of population and employment growth. And another transition matter, so the province has also released it's called its proposed approach to implementation of the proposed provincial planning statement. So it's a helpful document that gives some additional details about how this will all get rolled out. But one of the interesting things that it said, and I should have talked about it when we were discussing the employment policies, is that there's an expectation that the province has that municipalities will recognize site-specific permissions for certain uses in employment areas that would sort of no longer be recognized as a result of the change to the definition of employment area. So the process for that and what that looks like, it remains to be seen, but there's certainly guidance from the province that, commercial uses, retail uses, office uses in employment areas, there might be some site-specific amendments that are going to be necessary to recognize those existing uses. So next steps, written feedback may be submitted on the ERO in response to the posting number that's set out here. And the deadline for comments is June 6th, 2023. And it's anticipated that the provincial planning statement will come into force in the fall of 2023. And that went faster than I thought, but that's just a half an hour overview of the provincial planning statement. And, I have my partner, John Mascaren's name on the last slide. I am not John Mascarin, but he is one of a number of excellent lawyers that I work with at Aird and Burles. And anyone who has questions about these changes is welcome to give us a call. Because we're certainly tracking all of this. And so, I'm sitting here looking out my window. I can see 3 cranes at the Dufferin Galleria as it goes up. And so, these policies really do affect what we see when we look out the window. And that's why we're really keeping tabs on it and, excited to see what it all looks like when it gets rolled out and when consistency with the provincial planning statement becomes a reality. So thank you so much. And I'm happy to take some questions.
So, you know what, Laura, why would I give you like 30 seconds to review the questions? Pick, I don't know, 3 questions, 4 questions, really, the ones you think are really meaningful, and answer those.
Right, so we've got some questions about the Greenbelt plan, that there is some interesting discussion about that. And so I can read the question and then I'll let you know. But let me just make sure there we go. So I'm going to keep looking through the questions. We've got a question about, it says the policies in the growth plan and PPS 2020 would continue to apply where the Greenbelt plan refers to them. Therefore, will the changes relating to lot creation apply in the Greenbelt? Also, would the Bill 97 changes for ARUs apply in the Greenbelt? So this is an interesting one. The transition document that the province has put out has said that exactly that the growth plan PPS would continue to apply in the Greenbelt plan. So the proposed changes, I'm not sure, it seems like most likely that they would not apply in the Greenbelt because the Greenbelt plan continues to refer to these policies. That said, there's still the ability for the minister to, make regulations to have different policies apply. So right now, my answer to that would be that the lot creation policies do not apply in the Greenbelt. It's not something I've spent a lot of time considering, but based on what we've heard from the province, the policies in the growth plan and PPS would apply in the Greenbelt, and the minister has the ability to enact various regulations about what policies of the PPS and which PPS would apply. So I hope that answers that one. There's a question, if there is no municipal comprehensive review anymore, how is servicing and infrastructure planning to be coordinated? Great question. I don't have an answer for that. It seems to me that there's just more emphasis being placed on municipalities to, take control of their official plan review and in accordance with still the requirement for, review after 5 years or 10 years after a new official plan. So within that process, I think the idea is that municipalities would take it on themselves to determine such things as servicing and infrastructure. But again, good question. I think these are some of the things that we have to consider when we're looking at what is no longer going to be included from the growth plan. So yeah, it's one thing to review the document as it is, and then it's another to think, oh, what isn't in here anymore, and to try to wrap your head around the implications of that. Right, okay, and there's another question says, can you elaborate on the changes in definition on employment area and its associated transition provisions? It says, oh, sorry. Aird and Burles suggested from our earlier communique that municipalities would need to adopt OP policies that specifically authorize the continuation of that lawfully existing use before the new definition came into effect. Could you elaborate further on that? What is in the province's discussion on transition is really all the information that I have. And so if you refer to that document, it talks about, the need for timely site-specific policies, and that's really all we've got. So I'd love to provide some more details on that, but for now, I'm not sure what the province has in mind. So I think, municipalities need to take that guidance, and it's guidance for now. There's nothing sort of in the actual planning statement that gives us much guidance on that. So it's something I can take away also and sort of think about it a little bit more in terms of the mechanics. But for now, there's this statement that the province has made that it expects that there would be some recognition of these existing uses. And okay, the next question, how would the changes to employment areas definition and related policies affect the process for land use conversions to residential use, both for heavy industrial lands, still employment areas, and for non-industrial area institutional commercial lands? So this is one I have to sort of think about a little bit more too. Yeah, so for non-industrial employment area lands, there would be no requirement for the conversion. It's about the area. You're converting lands that are within that area in an employment area. But with respect to the process for conversions for heavier industrial lands, you would just have to consider this test that I went through and that still exists. It's the same test that we're familiar with in terms of what would be required for a conversion. It's the same as what would be required for a removal, basically. But it could just happen outside of the municipal comprehensive review. So, the type of lands, heavier industrial, would be considered when you're applying that test, and it would factor in when you're considering things like whether there is an alternative location for that type of use, et cetera. So that's sort of where you might consider the sort of type of activities taking place on those lands, and I hope that answers that question. Okay, and then someone's asked a question about the policies for agricultural areas. And the question is, for agricultural lands, do the additional residential units need to be tied to the agricultural use itself? Let me just turn to my slide on that so that I can. Well, so they have to be, as I said, that the units have to be subordinate to the principal dwelling. And the principal dwelling is considered an agricultural use, I believe. I didn't include that on my slide, but there is another policy that sort of says that the principal dwelling is an agricultural use. And so, it's an interesting question, actually, when you think about it, because there's some interpretation that would be required. So if the principal dwelling is an agricultural use, then does that make the additional units also that are subordinate to that, are they as well tied to the agricultural use? I guess de facto they would be, given that that principal dwelling is an agricultural use. So, and again, lots of food for thought there. So there's another question. There are some good examples of old manufacturing and warehouse buildings readapted to office use. And there's the example of 401 Richmond in Toronto. By removing office uses from employment designation, what would it mean for these types of initiatives? I mean, I guess it depends on whether or not those buildings are in employment areas to begin with. For example, 401 Richmond is not. So in that case, there wouldn't be sort of an impact on that type of use. it's more for when there are existing employment areas that have that maybe, say, I was trying to think about an
It's actually
example
where
here.
you just mentioned your area, and there's a really big employment stretch at Gary Avenue
Gary,
and like DuPont kind of area. So that would be a good example. Anything that is purple or dark purple. I mean, I guess just a light purple in the land use map of the official plan. There are two kind of interesting questions. Do you think that this will actually help housing supply and the affordability crisis? I really like this question. Will it help the ultimate goal of actually tackling this crisis? And I think we will wrap up with this question.
Sure. I mean, I hope so. If I'm expressing my personal opinion, I hope that everything the government is trying to do is going to contribute towards addressing the housing crisis. I really hope so. What I see is an attempt to remove certain restrictions, certain hurdles, and if the result makes it easier for development to occur, then hopefully that it has its intended result. But I think the question, and I've done more of an overview than sort of a commentary. I think because I think there's lots of different ways we might want to critique some of what's here, and I've been tempered on purpose because I like the audience to make up its own mind. But this comes as at a cost. There's significant changes that are being made to our prime agricultural areas. There's significant changes being made to different uses that could potentially be put side by side and things we have never seen before. And so that might come at a cost, and certainly a different kind of built environment than we're used to. But if that leads to an increase in housing, maybe that's what we have to do. We'll see. So I think there is a lot that we will wait to see, and as these months go by, and we're keeping track of new builds. So perhaps update in a year or so, and we can see what the impact has been. But the province is certainly focused on increasing the housing supply and this idea of complete communities. So stay tuned.
Laura, thank you very much. And thank you for providing your details. You know what, before we go, let me do that. I'm going to put in the chat a link to this recording, so I will get way less emails asking for this, for the recording. So here it is, a link to our YouTube channel with the recording of this webinar. Laura, thank you very much for this webinar. Everyone else, have a great